James Weldon Johnson's poem, The Creation, is written in oratorical style. If the poem is read aloud, it sounds like a spirited sermon being recited in a church. Johnson achieves this quality by the way he constructs the lines of the poem. Like a skilled public speaker, he repeats certain words over and over. Many stanzas of the poem begin with the phrase, "Then God," and Johnson also repeats the word "and" at the beginning of consecutive lines. These repeated words give the poem structure and rhythm, allowing the reader to feel how a preacher might stress the word "and" in each line if the sermon were being read in the church. The rhythm of the poem is also enhanced by the fact that Johnson arranges almost every line in the same way. First, he presents the subject of the line, usually God, then he tells what the subject does. When repeated over and over, this construction or syntax makes an almost hypnotic sound and a type of rhythm or beat is created. Let's see the summary of the poem. Johnson's version of the story of creation offers an image of God who is more like humans than traditional Old Testament portrayals of God. God is sometimes referred to as the uncaused cause or the prime mover, indicating that the actions of God cannot be traced to any previous reason as part of the definition of God. But Johnson gives God human qualities. He speaks in a southern dialect. He steps with feet and he creates the universe because he is lonely. To the reader not trained in theology, the study of religion, these humanistic qualities are familiar and make sense. Line 5 refers to the eye of God, drawing attention to a physical characteristic that this God shares with humans. Cypress trees are trees with dense hanging foliage that grow in the southern United States, which is also the geographic location of most swamps. The South is also where most Negroes lived in the early part of the century, having descended from slave families, and these references would have been familiar to them. Lines 10 to 13 repeat the words "and the" at the beginning of each line. This stylistic trait mimics the biblical story of creation, in which the phrase "and God said" is repeated consistently throughout the passage. This rhetoric technique is often used in oral text, in speeches, and especially in sermons. The repetition helps those audience whose attention has drifted off reconnect with that the speaker is saying. In the Old Testament, the separation of light from darkness occurs in a manner similar to the process described in the poem, except that the language is, of course, more formal. God does not roll light into the form of a sun or fling the remaining light into the darkness to create the moon and stars. Adding this language is Johnson's contribution, making the story more active and therefore more interesting to the reader-listener. This sort of concrete imagery is also used in the Bible to a lesser degree, turning philosophical concepts into experiences. In this section of the poem, the technique of repetition is again brought into play, with the word "and" beginning 5 lines out of 12 and God's refrain "that's good" being repeated. This phrase expresses the same idea as the familiar phrase "it is good" that is said by God in the Bible. But while the biblical God makes a dispassionate observation, Johnson's God exclaims his approval with enthusiasm, perhaps even with a little surprise. In line 17, Johnson uses the vernacular "ablazing," helping to personalize the sermon. The next section details the body of God, placing the sun, moon, and stars around his head and the earth beneath his feet. The shape of the earth's surface is formed by God's movements and not simply because of his will, as the Old Testament version describes it. God creates the atmospheric conditions through the actions of his body, spitting, clapping, batting his eyes. As in the rest of the poem, God's physical presence is central to his power of creation. In line 48, the author breaks from the story of creation to linger for a moment on the significance of it, adding the idea of cooling waters to what line 46 has already said about rain. In the next section, nature is anthropomorphized, a term that means to give human characteristics to non human entities. Pine trees are said to have fingers, oaks have arms, lakes cuddle, and the rivers run. The creation of humans is approaching, and God approves of these human like traits. His smile creates a rainbow recognized as a sign of nature's beauty. The intimacy between God and nature is made clear as the rainbow curls like a pet about him. In the Revised Standard Version of the Old Testament, God says, "Let the waters bring forth swarms of living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth across the firmament of the heavens." And 3 lines later, he says, "Let the earth bring forth creatures according to their kinds." In shortening this to bring forth, Johnson does away with some of the details of the creation, but he captures a sense of God's power and his excitement about what he is doing. The pace at which God has been creating things has accelerated to a point where he can hardly speak or move his hand quickly enough to keep up with his thoughts. For the third time, the phrase "that's good" is uttered. Completing a cycle, storytelling is often paced in thirds, representing a beginning, a middle, and an end. As the next stanza shows, God expected upon saying "that is good" a third time to be finished with the task of creation. Line 61 to 69 is a tranquil passage in the poem, following a frenzy of creation as God looks over the things he has made. The reader or listener knows that the creation is not complete until humans have arrived, and that the quiet passage here is a lull, not an end. This passage ends with God's observation that "I am lonely still," which negates the wonders of earth and sky that have just been presented, putting God back in the same predicament he had in the first line. God thinks in the next stanza and decides to make a man. In the first stanza, upon realizing himself lonely, God did not think but decided without consideration to create the world. This structure emphasizes how special humans are. As the answer to a perplexing problem, mankind could almost be called the answer to God's prayer. It is significant that line 72 is very specific about the fact that God sat beside a river, describing it as deep and wide. In African American mythology, the river is a central image, especially the deep, wide Mississippi River, which ran from the free states of the North to the slave states of the South. This idea is also referred to in Langston Hughes's poem, "The Negro Speaks of Rivers." In the next stanza, the river is emphasized. The reader is given a view of God being humble in the dust, molding clay, bending like a mammy. At the same time, though the author mixes in a reminder in lines 80 to 84 of the overwhelming powers of God, saying that God could create the universe effortlessly, but that he takes such loving care in the creation of humans should be a source of pride for the human race. Man's self-esteem is raised by the close association to God. Line 88 stresses the relationship between God and humans more clearly. For the oppressed, as the American Negroes were during segregation, the importance of this story would be that all people are godlike and were created to God's intent. Since God in this poem speaks with an African American dialect, it is fair to assume that the person he made is African American. The actual creation of life, mentioned briefly in lines 89 to 90, is given much less attention than the structuring of the human body. This poem makes no explicit points about what conclusions its readers should draw from all of this, but ends abruptly with the traditional words for closing a sermon. Every religion has a creation myth. If the principal function of religion is to explain mysteries to people who have not developed scientific explanations or who do not believe that the truth can be found by the scientific method, There could be no greater mystery to be explained than the creation of the universe, the origin of existence. As history has progressed, we have come to rely more and more upon carbon dating and astrological data that support scientific theories about how the universe came into existence. At various times in history, religious beliefs have come into conflict with scientific accounts. To this day, some Christian religions reject the theory that humans are a product of a chain of evolution that traces back to single celled organisms, noting that it contradicts the book of Genesis in the Old Testament of the Bible, which is retold in this poem. The God depicted in the poem created humans in his own image with great tender care after his previous accomplishments had failed to satisfy him. Many biblical scholars warn that the stories told in the Bible are not meant to be taken literally, but are meant as symbolic indicators of how things are in relation to one another, pointing, for example, to the fact that the first day mentioned in Genesis could not be a day as we know it because the sun had not been invented yet. It is therefore symbolic. Given this looser interpretation, the creation is not offering us a different story than the traditional biblical telling, but is presenting an example of God's concern about the things of this world. All natural phenomena are found good, but man is made with tenderness and care like a mammy bending over her baby. To the oppressed African Americans who were not allowed to participate as full citizens in America of the early 20th century, God's concern was a reminder of each man's inherent dignity.